Chapter 10. Friday morning. She woke up the next morning, bouncy and full of energy. She would finally get some answers about all the antiques on the property. And then she'd talk to Nan about it, because no way would Doreen sell specific pieces of value without Nan's permission. Regardless of its worth, maybe Nan had an emotional or sentimental attachment to some of them. Breakfast first, then a little bit of gardening in her own backyard, and she found herself waiting impatiently for Fen Gunderson to arrive. When she finally saw a vehicle drive up and park in her driveway, she rushed out the front door. The older man who walked up had a cane and appeared to be one step away from death. But then he smiled at her, and she realized he was probably only about in his mid-70s. She walked down the front porch steps to meet him. "Thank you so much for coming," she said with a bright smile. "Let me apologize again for the poor reception you got from me on the phone last night." He waved away her words. "No apology necessary. Particularly when you live alone. One can't be too careful." She agreed. So far, she hadn't been too concerned for herself or the house, but if valuable antiques were here. She led the way up the front steps, then turned to him. "Did you know my grandmother?" He stopped and frowned. "Did she pass on?" "Oh my goodness, no," she said. "She used to live here, that's all. That's why the past tense. She's at Rosemore Manor." A look of relief settled on his face. "Oh, that's good," he said. "I've known Nan for a long time. She's quite a character." Doreen wasn't sure from his tone whether he meant that in a good way or a bad way. She imagined Nan had created both her share of enemies and friends. Doreen led him inside to the living room. "She left me everything in this house," she said. "As you can see, it's incredibly overstuffed. And I would like to sort through what is of value and what isn't." He stopped in his tracks and looked around the room. "Wow. She has packed it full, hasn't she?" Doreen chuckled. Muggs, who'd been on the front porch steps with her, kept sniffing around the old man's trousers. She reached down and pulled him back. "Now you stay out of the way, Muggs." At that moment, Thaddeus, snoozing atop his living room roost, opened his eyes and squawked at the disturbance. Doreen walked over and chuckled. "Sorry, Thaddeus. We didn't mean to disturb your sleep." Fen smiled. "Isn't that a treat? I've met this guy a time or two." Thaddeus crowed, "A time or two. A time or two." And they both chuckled. She motioned at the living room as a whole. "Maybe we should start here." He agreed. He leaned his cane against one of the chairs and walked toward the nearest piece of furniture, a large rich mahogany hutch pushed up against the staircase. She figured it was about 6 feet tall and took up a good 4-foot wide space. A nice piece, but she'd do a lot to be rid of it. It really slowed progress down the hallway. Plus it was in the way, and it made the room look so much smaller. Fen nodded, then looked at it again. "Can you pull it out slightly?" She joined him at that side of the hutch, reached down and pulled it forward slightly, thankful it shifted relatively easily on the hardwood floor. She didn't want to scrape the floor and damage it, or the piece. He muttered as he looked over the back of the hutch, then returned to the front, and continued to murmur. She wasn't exactly sure if the muttering was good or bad, or if he was not quite all here. She walked into the kitchen, grabbed a notepad, took a picture of the piece they were discussing, and put a numeral 1 on top of the notepad page. When he finally turned to her, he said, "It's a nice piece, not very rare, but it's a good maker. Hanover always was known for the pride of their product. But their stuff before 1960 was better." "This is a 1960s piece," he said. "I can't find any proof of that, of course, but I would wager this is some of their lesser quality work." She frowned at that. "So this is a less valuable piece because of that?" He nodded sagely. "Yes, my dear. It'll still fetch you a nice price. You know, maybe $1,100 to $1,200. She stared at him. How much? $1,100 to $1,200. Now, if we could prove some kind of a history to it, we'd likely get more, and provenance would help to age it properly. If it is before 1960, it would be worth twice that. She made notes as fast as she could, as he continued on and on about the color and the stain job and the corners. Something about how the corners had been done was extra special. So it made him question the 1960 date of the piece. He'd gone back to muttering, as he opened every drawer, every door, checking the joints inside and out. Finally he turned and said, "Ask your grandmother if you would find any receipts for it." She nodded. "I will." With his help, she moved the piece back up against the wall. "Well, that's obviously worth a more favorable amount of money than I had expected," she admitted. He turned and pointed to the small corner table in the back. "Now that is worth a small fortune." He looked at her. "Do you mind if I take a closer look?" She shook her head. "Please be my guest." She took a picture of the item, as he muttered over it. It was just a small corner table. But he had it upside down, tapping the base. "Take a picture of this," he said, "because that's your maker's mark. And that's what makes this worth at least $7,000, maybe $8,000. She froze, almost dropped her notebook and pencil. "For that piece?" Her voice rose in a squeak. He nodded. "Absolutely." He looked at it again. "It's a lovely piece." He stroked the top in admiration, almost as if it was a loved one or a beloved pet. He sighed happily. "That is so worth making the trip for." "I'm so glad you're here," she said. She didn't want to admit to him that she had been ready to put it outside at the curb and stick a free sign on it to see if anybody wanted to come by and cart it off for her. "When you're ready to sell some of these pieces," he said, "let me know, and I'll put you in touch with an auction house." "Is that a good idea?" she asked anxiously. "Isn't an antiques dealer better to deal with?" "You could, but then you'll lose money on their commission, which usually runs 30%, he said. "Special antique auctions are held where you'll get top dollar. Still have to pay a commission, but the auctions usually command a much higher selling price." "Wow," she muttered as she continued to write. After that, he studied piece after piece after piece. And one that she particularly liked was all done in knotty pine. He looked at it, shook his head, and said, "This is one of those Swedish put-together-from-a-box things. I think they call it pre-box." He never checked for a maker's mark. She stared at it. "I really like it." He shot her a look of disgust. "You're surrounded by beautiful pieces, and you chose the cheapest in the entire place." He shook his head and moved on to the next item. She groaned. "I think it was the color of the wood I liked," she offered. She didn't want him to look at her lack of taste and take it as her disdain of the work he did. "That's what all wood looks like," he said, "before it's treated. Most of these pieces are stained. That one barely has any finish on it." He stroked the side of it and said, "You feel that roughness to it?" She reached out and nodded. "That's because they didn't do a full sanding, another coat, then another sanding, followed by another coat. All they did was a basic sealant." "Cheap," he said. "Keep it if you must, if you like it. But since you're looking to sell some of these pieces, then sell the ones you don't care about. Because a lot of money is here in this living room." By the time they had gone through just this room, she was stunned. So many of these pieces were real antiques. Her soon-to-be ex-husband would be over the moon. Nan had never, in any way, made a comment about the value of the pieces she'd left behind. It was just too much for Doreen. She sat down on the couch beside Fen. "May I get you a cup of tea?" He looked at her gratefully. "If you wouldn't mind," he said, "a glass of water would be preferred." She nodded and rushed into the kitchen, where she poured him a glass of water and put on the tea kettle for her. When she returned, he was studying the couch under the window. It had faded and showed its age. But it had big wooden arms sticking out from the big puffy cushions. And all along the back was more wood. Ornate scrolls covered the entire thing. It was comfortable, but it was very outdated. She wasn't a fan. Goliath, on the other hand, lying atop the back of the couch, appeared to love it. He stared at the stranger in the house, and the stranger stared back. She was about to hand Fen his glass of water when he said, "You do realize that cat is lying on a $10,000 piece of furniture?" She almost dropped the glass of water as she gave it to him. "How much?" she asked in a faint voice. He smiled. "You had no idea, did you?" She moved her head from side to side. "No. But it is definitely music to my ears." "If you're not an antiques person," he said, "you're sitting on a gold mine." She pointed to the couch and questioned, "Literally?" He patted the side. "We need to see the underside. Although I already know what this is. It's a Queen Anne couch. Circa 1818, he said. "You can tell from the designs on the footings here." She was seriously gobsmacked. She sank down into a chair. I had no clue. She hated to envision that all her money worries were over because, so far, these were just figures. Not a sale in hand nor any money in her fist. He pointed at the chair she was in. "That is a matching chair you're sitting in." She bounced up. "Is it worth something too?" "Because you have this partial set," he said, "the two pieces, it'll add another easy $5,000, possibly $10,000 to the total price. It was part of a large bedroom set originally. I doubt you'd have the other pieces, but I'm happy to see this much of one." She wanted to break out in a song and dance, but at the same time, she could feel the tremors rocking through her. "I need to talk to Nan," she said. I wonder if she had any idea. "Oh, she knows," he said. "I talked to her about this couch a long time ago." He looked around and frowned. "Do you know where the other chair is?" She looked at him blankly. He pointed at the chair. "Nan used to have two of them." Doreen said, "Just a minute." She ran upstairs. Sure enough, in the master bedroom, underneath the heap of clothing she had taken off her bed last night, was the matching chair. Carefully, she removed the clothing and picked up the chair, carrying it to the living room. His face lit up when he saw it. "Turn it upside down for me, will you?" She flipped it over and he crowed with delight. "See here. That's the maker's mark you want, and it confirms it's part of the same set." He sighed happily. "Please tell me that you'll sell these." "Oh, I'm selling them," she said. "I can't afford not to." "You see. That's where you're different from Nan. She could afford not to. She loved them and she used them well. In your case, if you don't love them and could use the money, you're probably better off selling them." He shot a look at the cat again, who was now stretched out over the couch cushion. The more damage, the less value. She wanted to snatch up Goliath. But he was likely to dig in his claws even deeper. He eyed the coffee table. "That may be part of the original set as well, if you find a maker's mark underneath. I'll leave that to you. Plus, we really need those provenance papers." She nodded. How could this set possibly not sell? The animals could deteriorate the value very quickly. He chuckled. "When I get home, I'll make a few calls. I might get an appraiser to connect with you. Better to get one who can deal with buyers too." "Yes, please," she said. "Selling these pieces would help a lot to open up this living room." He nodded. "And while you're at it, you may want to offer up the Turkish rug you're standing on." She jumped back onto the hardwood floor. He nodded. "It's very old. I've talked to Nan several times about selling it." "It's for sale," Doreen said, hating the busy pattern, making it hard to see anything else in the room. but it does need a major cleaning. Don't touch it, he said. You'll ruin it. Why is that? Because it's wool with silk threads through it. It must be commercially cleaned by a specialist. She swallowed hard and nodded. She hated to even think about the number of times she might have spilled tea on it. I know I sound terribly money-minded, but what would something like that fetch? He shrugged. The appraiser will do a much better job at estimating its current worth. But I would say at least $6,000, maybe $7,000. It could easily be twice that, depending on the condition of the rug, after a proper cleaning. He leaned over and separated the threads. She could see the deep, rich cream color underneath. Is it supposed to be that color? He smiled. The damage doesn't appear to be all the way through. It's just surface dirt, so it should wash well. She wanted to sit down, but didn't have a clue where she could possibly sit. And then she looked over at the hearth of the fireplace, which she had yet to light, and sat down on the slate. The sooner you can put me in touch with somebody, the better, she said quietly. What about Nan? She nodded and held up her notebook. I'll visit her this afternoon. Good. He straightened up. Maybe I could come back in a few days, after you talk to the appraiser. He looked around the room. Honestly, the sooner you sort out these pieces, the better, so you can see what else is here. It takes time to go through so many pieces. She nodded. Absolutely. Thanks for offering. First, though, is the appraiser. You will send me the contact information, won't you? I don't plan to die on the way home, so you'll be sure to get it when I get there. She flushed. I'm so sorry. She blustered her way through an apology. I don't know what's gotten into me. You see a sudden source of income here, and I imagine you've had a pretty rough time of it lately, he said. But I'm happy the antiques will re-enter the world to some collector who will love them. Nan has loved them, but her time here is gone. And they're not your thing, are they? She winced. Not really. He looked scathingly over at the light-colored pine hutch. Anybody who loves this should part with the antiques. He made his way out the door. That doesn't mean I don't want to see these items go to somebody who will love them, she said quickly. He waved at her. I'll call you when I get home. And she had to be satisfied with that.